Welcome to another great week of Outside the Circle, guys. As we continue in the Sermon on the Mount tonight, we'll get into the how-tos. This section is really full of Jesus just telling us how to do certain things. I mean, it's literally each subtitle in the section is called like how to blank, and so we'll get into a couple of those. So just a quick recap. Week 1, we talked about how Jesus flipped the faith on its head, that he just came out swinging and was very clear of like, this ain't your grandma's religion anymore, and just how things are going to be different, but they're not different because they're actually different. They're actually different because he's taking it back to the heart of what God made it to be, which kind of gets into week 2, where we talked about where Jesus literally gets to the heart of it. It gets to the heart of people and how we as believers should be on the inside and not worried about outward appearance, but inward. Which is kind of funny because this week he actually changes course a little bit. He focuses on the outward a little bit more this week than he does the inward, while also still focusing on the inward as well. So, you know, both outward and inward. But really, it's what it boils down to at the end of the day is we see that the points that Jesus wants to make here, a lot of these are a direct attack at the Pharisees and what they teach and do. And again, we see this a lot in his writings, especially even in the Sermon on the Mount. But this section is even more evident of that, of things that the Pharisees do and say, and basically being like, hey, don't be like that. It's kind of where he's at now. So let's get into it. This first little section is titled How to Give. So starting in Matthew 6, verse 1. Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. Otherwise, you have no reward with your Father in heaven. So whenever you give to the poor, don't sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets to be applauded by people. Truly I tell you, they have their reward. But when you give to the poor, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be done in secret, and your Father in heaven, who sees this in secret, will reward you. So right off the bat, we see Jesus is concerned with the outward, but he calls for us to internalize it to an extent, warning us not to practice outward giving. And what that really is boiling down to is don't be flashy about it. Don't be showy. Again, this is a direct attack on the Pharisees, as they would often parade around and brag about giving from their excess. In fact, we actually see Jesus encounter a situation like this at the end of Mark chapter 12. We see that Jesus praises this woman for giving all that she had because she gave with all of her heart, but he condemns the rich folks who were flashy with their giving. This is exactly what he tells us not to do here. He'd rather us be like that poor woman, giving from a place of generosity and not of greed and pride. That's what all of this is about, being generous and not needing to be recognized by man, but by God. When these rich folks would go and give and be flashy about it, they wanted everyone to pay them attention. They wanted to see what they were doing. That's what the Pharisees are known for. They want people to say, well, look how holy I am because of how much I give. Look how great I am because of what I'm giving and how much. But again, most of this was out of excess. This wasn't even like they really needed that money. It was just like oh, hey, I have some extra, change left over. Here you go, whatever. But yet the woman who gave what very little she had, again, most people would have just turned a blind eye to her. They wouldn't have noticed her. They wouldn't have, because her money doesn't ring the same because it's not as much. And yet Jesus noticed it, and that's exactly what he says the Father's heart is like, which makes sense since Jesus and God are one and the same. Jesus is like, oh yeah, nobody else noticed this woman, but I did, and I blessed her because of this, and I brought to everyone else's attention how wonderful this woman is because of what she did. But yet none of you notice her. And so you see that same thing, what Jesus is saying here, by saying, look, nobody else might notice what you're doing. Nobody else might notice all the giving or whatever it may be, anything you're doing from a generous heart. But I see you, and I recognize it, and I will reward you for that. Sometimes in this life, sometimes not, but it will be rewarded. That's a promise from God. And when there's a promise from God, you can always rely on it. And so this is where Jesus gets into is the heart of generosity or the heart of giving is generosity, and that we should always give generously without worrying about whether we're seen or not, because then it's about us, not about being generous to someone else. And when it comes to generosity, it needs to be about the other person, not ourselves. And it needs to be through the lens of serving God and helping his people rather than serving so that we get the joy of feeling it. Like, don't get me wrong, because you're serving God, like, you will feel good about it, but it doesn't need to be like I need to feel good because people give me praise. It's you feel good because you know you're doing what God has called you to do. So that's all that this how to giving is all about. The next one we see is how to pray. Now this one's kind of split into two parts because we have the act of praying, and then Jesus also kind of gives us how we should practically pray. So he kind of gives a layout. So we'll kind of get into that, but we're going to start with how we should act when praying. So let's pick it up in verse 5. Whenever you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites, because they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by people. Truly I tell you, they have their reward. But when you pray, go into the private room, shut your door, and pray to your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. When you pray, don't babble like the Gentiles, since they imagine they'll be heard for their many words. Don't be like them, because your Father knows the things you need before you ask them. So, second verse, same as the first, guys. Jesus goes after the Pharisees. He says not to be outward about your prayers. Now, this doesn't mean you can't pray corporately, like when you're praying in a Sunday school class or in your life groups or when you're praying with an individual. Like, obviously, that's not what he's getting out here. These were like single prayers that people were doing where they would basically just be walking in the middle of the street praying out loud for all to hear because they wanted people to notice, oh, look at them praying their elegant speech and their wonderful things. It's like, that's not what it's about. So this isn't saying you shouldn't pray out loud, especially in a group setting. But like with giving, Jesus is commending the practice of showing and getting attention. The Pharisees would often say these long, elaborate prayers in front of everyone to show just how holy they were. And they would use these grand phrases or just babble on for, 30, 40 minutes just to say, look, I can pray this long. And it's not saying 20, 30-minute prayers are bad. I mean, if you're actually in a prayer, go for it. But again, this is all about attention. And Jesus is saying none of this matters, It's kind of like the giving. I don't need this grandiose, big, elaborate prayer. Like, I can just do a simple prayer like, God, I just need help, and period. And it's like to Jesus, that's more meaningful than the big, elaborate one. Because, again, it's all in your heart posture with it. Are you praying to him and actually just wanting to talk to him and hear from him, or are you doing it for people and to get the attention from people noticing that, oh, I can speak a lot and I can say all these grand words and I can say these big biblical phrases in here just to sound all religious, and it's like, that's not what it's about, that, a simple prayer from your heart is all that Jesus needs and honestly requires of us, Again, not saying you can't pray for a while, because sometimes it's necessary. When life gets hard, sometimes you need those 30, 40-minute prayers. But that doesn't have to be out and about in front of everyone. That's more in secret of like just you and God just having that moment together. It's again, not about getting the attention, but having that time with God is very important. So again, similar to giving, it's not about attention. It's about your heart posture towards God. So Jesus even actually decides to help us a little bit and show us how we should pray. So let's pick up in Matthew 9. Many of you will actually probably recognize this. If you ever heard the Lord's Prayer, this is where it comes from. So verse 9, therefore you should pray like this. Our Father in heaven, your name be honored as holy. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we forgive forgiven our debtors. And do not bring us into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. Now, it's probably a little different than most of us. Trust me, the one I have memorized over the years is definitely the KJV version. Again, I usually read through CSB. That's just the one I prefer and I like. But same principles, it's It's not changing what's actually being said. So now, when Jesus gives us this example, this isn't saying this is the only prayer we should always say. In fact, it really comes at us as a kind of a fill in the blanks type of prayer. So let's just kind of break it down. And honestly, as I'm quoting it, I'll probably end up saying more of the KJV version just because that's the one I'm more comfortable with, so I don't have to keep looking back at my Bible. So the first part, Our Father in heaven, hallowed be thy name. So this is an address to God. This is calling out to who you know this prayer is being sent to and where the power of this prayer comes from. Because there is power in prayer, and that power from prayer comes strictly from God. And so to be able to start off of saying, like, of addressing of who you know, it's not just about God, it's about us. Like, God knows who he is. But sometimes it's good for us to have that of like, okay, God, first off, I am addressing you. But secondly, this way I know who I'm addressing. That I know that I'm praying to the God of the universe, the Father in heaven. So again, Father showing the close relationship we have to him, that we can call him Father. But then the side of understanding that he's in heaven, he's the creator of everything. He's bigger than us. And we're calling on that Father to help us. And just praising his name, hallowed be thy name, of understanding who he is and the power that comes with that. Next part is, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. This one's all about submitting our will to God's will and asking for his will to take place. And this one can be hard, especially when coming with him with a petition or with something we want. Obviously we're allowed to do that. Like, God wants us to cast our cares on him. We see this in First Peter, I believe it is, talking about casting our cares on him. He wants to hear it. He wants to know. But, at first we also got to acknowledge who he is and say, look, your will be done overall. This is where our heart needs to be, is in alignment with your will. Next up, give us this day our daily bread. This is asking for God's provisions to provide for our needs. This is kind of where this isn't necessarily just like I want $1 million. Again, God's not a genie in a bottle, so don't start treating him like one. And that's why it says our daily bread. This is about providing our needs, providing what's necessary, because God will always provide for our needs. Whatever that looks like, he will always provide for our needs. And that this is kind of the idea, is like asking him for our needs again. So you kind of go from saying, God, I recognize who you are, into asking to be in alignment with his will, and then asking for your needs. It's definitely kind of a order of importance type situation, almost. I don't want to fully go there, but that's kind of what we're seeing here. So then next up, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. This one's the hard one. This one is asking God to forgive us of our wrongdoing, which is the easy side of that. But there's a caveat there, that we have to do the same to those who wrong us. And the fact that it's phrased that way is very intentional, saying, like, basically, don't ask me to forgive if you're not doing the same, And we see that elsewhere in Scripture, even from Jesus a couple of times, of, if we're not forgiving those who have wronged us, then why should we expect God to do the same for us? And that's a hard pill to swallow, and that's hard to do. But the beauty is, it also works the other way around. It's not just saying, hey, forgive us as we forgive others. It's a two-way street of, we can forgive others because of how God's forgiven us. And so how God shows us how he's forgiven us for our wrongdoing, it helps us to forgive those who have wronged us. And therefore it kind of comes back to us of, God's going to forgive us now. So it's kind of this weird little L shape of going up and then going out to others and then, coming back up in that way, because he shows us how to forgive. And then in doing so, we're able to forgive others, which of course helps with our relationship there. So that's kind of what we see here. And then lastly, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. This one's all about asking for God's protection, not just from Satan, but honestly from your own sin. It literally just says from evil. So obviously you go from Satan to really just yourself sometimes, because sometimes yourself might be the evil one. When it's your sin that's causing you to stumble or leading you down a destructive path. Like, this is kind of where you need to kind of be in line with God of being like, hey, you know, please deliver me, even though it might be my own doing, but deliver us from evil. This isn't just about protecting, it's pulling you from it, it's pulling you out of it so that you can flee it, that you can escape from it. So again, this isn't a word for word recitation. You don't have to say it. It's not saying it's wrong if you do, but you don't have to say it word for word like that. This is just kind of the blueprint of how you should pray and like how your heart posture should be when praying. And this leads us into our final how-to that Jesus gives us, and it's how to fast, which is a really interesting one. So let's pick back up in verse 16. When you fast, don't be gloomy like the hypocrites, for they make their faces unattractive so that their fasting is obvious to people. Truly I tell you, they have their reward. But when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face, so that your fasting isn't obvious to others, but to your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. So once again, Jesus is going straight after Pharisees. Once again, he's kind of laying it out of, hey, this isn't about the outside, it's about the inside, but everything you're doing, do it in secret so that your Father in heaven will notice you. Again, the Pharisees were really big on making it known that they were fasting, making it known that they were doing this. So like they would literally make themselves look sick, look deprived of food and nourishment and things like that, to show off, their quote unquote holiness. That's their way of doing it. It's like, oh, the more, closer to death, so to say, you look, the more holy you are because of the fact that, oh, that's just how well you're fasting. And, again, it's all about trying to get the attention of people around them so that people can validate their holiness, But Jesus is saying do the opposite. He's like, make yourself seem healthy. Like, make it where people don't realize you're actually fasting right now. Because fasting isn't about other people. It's about you and God. And again, that's what all these are about with giving, with prayer, with fasting. All these things are about, hey, stop trying to appease people and please the Lord. Again, these Pharisees are seeking after God's approval. Not God's approval, sorry. The Pharisees are seeking people's approval and not God's approval. Whereas as real believers, as God's children, we should be seeking his. And that's just kind of the theme of all of these how-tos, is that we should do everything with pure motives for the Lord and not for men. Men can't save us. God can. We should be doing this out of service and devotion to God, not trying to get people to, I guess, give us the stamp of approval on our holiness. Like, they're not our holiness. Like, we are only holy because God is holy. And when we accept Christ, he makes us holy in his sight because of his sacrifice, not because of what we've done or what anybody else could do for us. So we should, like, God is the only one that we should be seeking approval from, not man. So while these mainly deal with outer concepts, they're still very much heart driven. The running theme so far from Jesus this entire Sermon on the Mount is literally just getting to the heart of things. It's all about man's heart. And it's a heart that Jesus is seeking. He wants to purify us so that we can live a life that he has called us to, not for rules, but for liberation. This isn't about putting a structure on you. In fact, that's kind of what you're seeing the opposite. Like, the Pharisees set these structures of, hey, you should look like this, you should act like this, you should, do this, say these right words, so to say. And Jesus is like, no, I'm here to purify your heart, and the rest is going to follow. It's not about rules, but truly is about liberation and freeing you of your sin so that you don't have to necessarily act and be a certain way, but that you just are that way. This isn't about saying, oh, you need to live like this. It's about creating a heart in you that desires to live like that. Giving your heart to him is the most freedom you will ever experience. And sadly, so many of us don't want to. We think he's the one putting us in the cage, but it's like he's the one releasing us from that cage, because he wants our heart. Question is, are we willing to give it to him? That's all we got this week, folks. Thanks for joining.